May I ask a favor? May I ask a favor of you regarding him? May I ask a favor of you? May I ask a favor? Can you book the hotel for me? May I ask a favor of you? May I ask a moment alone with my father? May I ask a personal question? May I ask a question of a personal nature? May I ask a question of you? May I ask a question to her, too? May I ask a question, sir? May I ask a question? May I ask about your starting salary? May I ask after the health of your mother? May I ask again what you know about this man? May I ask an impertinent question, with no criticism intended? May I ask an indelicate question? May I ask first for other news? May I ask for just a bit more? May I ask for one example? May I ask for your phone number? May I ask him to call you back? May I ask his name, please? May I ask how far you are going? May I ask how he died? May I ask how it happened? May I ask how long cannot you know? May I ask how much the bonuses are? May I ask how much you can afford? May I ask how old are you? May I ask how old he is? May I ask how old you are? May I ask how things are proceeding? May I ask how you knew about this place? May I ask how your investigation is proceeding? May I ask if there would be any Saturday work? May I ask if you are fond of learning the internet? May I ask if you are fond of ways to possessing good English? May I ask if you are fond of ways to succeeding in diets? May I ask if you are married? May I ask if you're married? May I ask just a couple of questions? May I ask on what authority? May I ask one of you? May I ask one question? May I ask one thing? May I ask some questions first? May I ask the lieutenant a question? May I ask the nature of your business? May I ask the reason of your refusal? May I ask the telephone number of the other party? May I ask the time? May I ask the you want? May I ask then, what is your plan? May I ask what are you looking for here? May I ask what brought you here? May I ask what I'm supposed to do in the library? May I ask what is happening here? May I ask what is so funny? May I ask what is this regarding to, sir? May I ask what it is about? May I ask what it is you're doing? May I ask what it is? May I ask what it was? May I ask what it's called? May I ask what it's regarding? May I ask what my share might be? May I ask what name he answers to? May I ask what price range you have in mind? May I ask what street we are on? May I ask what the nature of the call is about? May I ask what the problem is, sir? May I ask what the problem is? May I ask what the starting pay is? May I ask what this is about? May I ask what this is for? May I ask what this is in reference to? May I ask what this is in regard to, sir? May I ask what this is in regard to? May I ask what this is pertaining to? May I ask what this is regarding? May I ask what you are getting at? May I ask what you are looking for here? May I ask what you are offering and whether it is negotiable? May I ask what you do? May I ask what you have in mind and whether it is related to our merger? May I ask what you were doing in my class? May I ask what your hobbies are? May I ask what your income is? May I ask what you're going to sleep in? May I ask what you're here about? May I ask what you're here for? May I ask what you're up to? May I ask what you're working on? May I ask what's the matter with it? May I ask what's up here? May I ask what's wrong with the map? May I ask when he's coming back? May I ask when you saw him last? May I ask where she was before? May I ask where we are? May I ask where you are from? May I ask where you are going? May I ask where you are? May I ask where you bought it? May I ask where you bought the coat? May I ask where you come from? May I ask where you're heading? May I ask whether you have any idea of paying me? May I ask who am I talking with? May I ask who I'm speaking with today? May I ask who I'm speaking with? May I ask who is calling, please? May I ask who is calling? May I ask who it is? May I ask who this is on the phone, please? May I ask who this is, please? May I ask who you are, sir? May I ask who you are? May I ask whom you're entertaining? May I ask who's calling, please? May I ask who's calling? 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 May I ask why exactly? May I ask why have you come to us from across the sea? May I ask why I am here? May I ask why not? May I ask why we're chasing rodents? May I ask why we're here? May I ask why you are doing this? May I ask why you are returning it? May I ask why you didn't tell me? May I ask why you don't eat? May I ask why you need to know all this? May I ask why you took that decision? May I ask why you took the children somewhere else to live? May I ask why you visit? May I ask why you want him? May I ask why you want to exchange it? May I ask why you want to know? May I ask why you'd like to return? May I ask why you're canceling the subscription? May I ask why you're closing your account with us today, sir? May I ask why you're doing this? May I ask why you're here? May I ask why you're seeking this information? May I ask why you're spying on him? May I ask why? May I ask you a couple of questions? May I ask you a favor? May I ask you a few questions? May I ask you a personal favor? May I ask you a personal question? May I ask you a question point blank? May I ask you a question, sir? May I ask you a question, young man? May I ask you a question? May I ask you a question? May I ask you a quick question? Sure. May I ask you a riddle? May I ask you a special favor? May I ask you a very personal question? May I ask you a very serious question? May I ask you all something? May I ask you all to join me in raising a glass to the bride and bridegroom? May I ask you another question then? May I ask you for a dance? May I ask you for further explanation on that part, Mr. Black? May I ask you for further explanation on that part, Mr. White? May I ask you if he could come to my office? May I ask you of your religion? May I ask you one more question? May I ask you one question? May I ask you one thing? May I ask you out with me, please? May I ask you out? May I ask you please to be more cordial in your questioning? May I ask you some question? May I ask you some questions? May I ask you something? May I ask you something else? May I ask you something personal? May I ask you something, sir? May I ask you something? May I ask you the reason why you made that decision? May I ask you the reason why? May I ask you to begin by introducing your team, please? May I ask you to confirm that? May I ask you to declare the vote null and void? May I ask you to explain the nature of your business in as few words as possible? May I ask you to give a big hand of applause for Professor Han? May I ask you to have her call me when she's back? May I ask you to identify yourself for the record? May I ask you to identify yourselves? May I ask you to keep this bag for a second? May I ask you to mind your own business? May I ask you to sign for me? May I ask you to step out of the vehicle? May I ask you to take a message, please? May I ask you what medical school you attended? May I ask you what your weight is? May I ask you where I can find those batteries? May I ask you where it is? May I ask you where you studied? May I ask you which bus I should take? May I ask you who it was? May I ask you who's calling? May I ask you why left the company? May I ask you why you want to commit suicide? May I ask your company name again? May I ask your contact number? Please. May I ask your help? May I ask your name and phone number? May I ask your name please? May I ask your name, please? May I ask your name? May I ask your opinion on this? May I ask your opinion on? May I ask your permission to take a day off to attend my son's graduation? May I ask your phone number? May I ask your position? May I ask your reasoning, please? May I ask your telephone number? May I ask, is he okay? May I ask, is it a working farm? May I ask, where are you located?